Hello and welcome. Today, we're going to examine one of the most harrowing, most chilling episodes in all of military history, Napoleon's catastrophic crossing of the Berezina River. Now, throughout our time together, we're going to explore how a massive economic gamble spiraled into a full-scale invasion. We'll break down the critical moments that led to the greatest army of the age being cornered and facing annihilation. And we'll tell the story of a river crossing that was, at the same time, a moment of military genius and an almost unimaginable human tragedy. It's a story so powerful, it literally burned a new definition of disaster into the French language.
So I want you to just picture this for a moment. It's late November, 1812. What's left of the Grande Armée, the largest, most powerful army Europe had ever seen, is now just a shadow of its former self. They're trapped, they're freezing, they're starving on the banks of this treacherous, ice-choked river. And to make matters worse, from 3 different directions, the full might of the Russian Empire is closing in, ready to deliver the final crushing blow.
So the question is, how on earth did it get this bad? Well, the thing you have to understand about the Berezina is that it wasn't just some random, unlucky event. No. This was the brutal, and you can almost say inevitable climax of a military campaign that was deeply flawed right from its very inception. To really get it, we need to wind the clock back to a high-stakes power play over economics that just spiraled completely out of control.
Okay, so let's look at the road to this disaster, because the path to the Berezina was really paved with Napoleon's own overconfidence. And the crazy thing is, this entire catastrophe didn't start with cannons and gunfire. It started with a trade embargo, an economic decision that would lead to a logistical nightmare that not even a military genius like Napoleon was prepared for.
See, Napoleon's master plan was to bring his ultimate arch-nemesis, Great Britain, to its knees. But not by invading them, no, he wanted to choke their economy. His weapon of choice was something called the Continental System, basically a massive blockade designed to cut Britain off from all trade with Europe. But in 1810, Tsar Alexander of Russia decided he'd had enough and started trading with the British again. For Napoleon, this wasn't just business, it was personal. It was a direct challenge to his power, and it was an act he felt he absolutely had to punish. So, in June of 1812, to make the Tsar pay for his defiance, Napoleon assembled this, the Grande Armée. We're talking about nearly 500,000 soldiers. Just let that number sink in. This wasn't just an army, it was a massive, multinational force, the very symbol of his imperial might, built for one purpose, to crush anyone who stood in its path.
But here is the fatal miscalculation. Napoleon's entire method of warfare, the very strategy that had made him a legend in the dense, fertile lands of Central Europe, completely fell apart in Russia. His armies were masters of moving fast and living off the land, but the Russians left them nothing but barren, scorched earth. The roads he was counting on turned into impassable mud pits, and the sheer, mind-boggling size of Russia stretched his supply lines to the breaking point, leaving them wide open for Cossack raids.
And the Russian strategy? Well, it was as ruthless as it was brilliant. As their armies fell back, they implemented this scorched earth policy with brutal efficiency. They destroyed everything. They burned crops, they leveled villages, they made sure there was absolutely nothing left for the invaders. They were deliberately creating a wasteland to starve the Grande Armée, not just of food, but of any glimmer of hope.
Napoleon's one big gamble was taking Moscow. He thought that if he could just capture their ancient capital, the Tsar would have no choice but to negotiate. But when he finally entered the city after the horrific slaughter at the Battle of Borodino, it was a ghost town. The Russians hadn't just abandoned Moscow, they had set it on fire. For 5 agonizing weeks, Napoleon waited in the smoldering ruins for a surrender that would never, ever come. And all the while, the infamous Russian winter began to tighten its icy grip. The invasion was over. The long, desperate retreat had begun.
That retreat? Well, it wasn't a retreat, it was a death march. It quickly devolved into a desperate scramble for survival. The army was falling apart, constantly harassed by Russian partisans, worn down by starvation and a cold so profound it was paralyzing. And that is what brings us, in late November, to the banks of the Berezina River, where what was left of the Grande Armée walked right into a perfectly laid trap. I mean, just take a moment to understand how hopeless this situation was. The main bridge they were counting on to cross the river, the Russians had already destroyed it, gone. Blocking their path to the west was Admiral Chichagov's army of 35,000 fresh troops. Meanwhile, from the north, Field Marshal Wittgenstein was closing in with 30,000 more, and coming up from behind, relentlessly pursuing them from the east, was General Milordovich with another 32,000. It was a vice, and it was closing fast.
In this moment of absolute, total despair, a single man's decision offered the tiniest sliver of hope. You see, earlier in the retreat, Napoleon had ordered his engineers to destroy their heavy bridge-building equipment to speed up the march. But one man, General Abele, the commander of the engineers, had the incredible courage to disobey that order. He saved his tools and his forges. And that single act of insubordination was about to become the army's only lifeline.
What happened next was just a masterclass in military engineering, born from sheer desperation. First, a brilliant diversionary tactic tricked Admiral Chichagov, making him think the crossing was happening further south. This bought them precious time. Then, General Abele and his 400 engineers became the heroes of the story. They waded into that lethally cold, freezing river to build 2 makeshift bridges. For hours on end they worked, submerged in the icy water, most of them to their deaths, while on both banks of the river, French soldiers fought with furious desperation to hold the Russians back.
But for the thousands of stragglers, the wounded, the sick, the civilians following the army, the crossing was a scene straight out of hell. When Russian artillery finally found the range of the bridges, the chaos turned into an absolute slaughter. We have this harrowing eyewitness account from a Sergeant Adrian Bergogne. He describes those final awful moments on November 29th when Napoleon gave the order to burn the bridges, leaving thousands of his own people trapped on the wrong side.
And so, Napoleon, along with the core of his fighting men, had escaped the trap. But to call this a victory would be a cruel joke. The price paid for that escape, the butcher's bill, was almost beyond imagination.
Let's just look at the numbers. They really do tell the story. Over just 3 days, the French lost around 25,000 soldiers, killed, wounded, or captured. But the fate of the non-combatants was even worse. An estimated 30,000 of them were killed or captured, just abandoned to the Cossacks and the unforgiving Russian winter. The Berezina wasn't a battle, it was a massacre.
And this number tells the story of the entire Russian campaign, of that massive army of nearly 500,000 men that marched proudly into Russia just 5 months earlier. This is how many managed to stumble back out. 49,000. The Grande Armée, the pride of the empire, the most feared military force on the planet, was simply gone.
And the impact of the Berezina went so much further than the battlefield. It left a deep, permanent scar on the French national consciousness.
The name of that river took on a whole new, dark meaning. Even today, in modern France, if something goes completely, horribly wrong, you might hear someone say, "C'est la Berezina." It has become a synonym for total disaster, for absolute failure. The battle itself became a powerful and painful national metaphor.
So, when we boil it all down, what are the lessons here? Well, it's a stark reminder that what starts as economic conflict can spiral into a devastating war. It shows us that logistics aren't some boring detail, they are the absolute lifeblood of any army. It proves that no matter how mighty your force is, ignoring the local environment can utterly doom you. And maybe most importantly, it reminds us that the true cost of war is always, always counted in human lives, soldiers and civilians alike. Before we finish, I really just want to personally thank you for taking the time to go on this journey with me. Exploring these powerful, often difficult moments in history is a true privilege, and having an engaged, curious audience like you is what makes creating these explainers so incredibly rewarding. So thank you.
And that leaves us with one final thought to ponder. The story of the Berezina reminds us that history isn't just a collection of facts and dates. It's about memory. It's about how a single event can become so traumatic it literally embeds itself into a nation's language, and how the echoes of a catastrophe on a frozen river can still resonate so clearly more than 200 years later. Thank you for watching.